Okay, good day, everybody. Thank you for being with us today. Right. Welcome to this new conference of the Webster Geneva Global Dialogue series. My name is Lionel Faton. I'm an assistant professor of international relations here at Webster University Geneva. And I'm pleased and honored today to have two distinguished panelists with me, Benoît Pelopidas and Pavel Podvig, to talk about the nuclear dimension of the war in Ukraine and its consequences. Thank you very much for being with us. It's a great honor for us. Let me rapidly introduce this crucial topic. The war in Ukraine that started on February 24th has awakened the old demon of the use of nuclear weapons. Only 3 days after the beginning of the war, Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, ordered his military to put deterrence forces on special mode of combat duty. 1 week ago, Russia tested the nuclear-capable intercontinental ballistic missile Sarmat, with Vladimir Putin saying the weapon, I quote, will provide food for thought to those who, in the heat of frenzied aggressive rhetoric, try to threaten our country. And yesterday, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who we know extremely well in Geneva, warned that the risk of nuclear confrontation, I quote, should not be underestimated. This may be bluff, this may be political signaling, but the Russian military doctrine says that Moscow could use nuclear weapons in a conventional war that threatens the existence of the Russian state. Now, and anyway, I mean, the threat of the use of nuclear weapons has already been made in Ukraine. I just mentioned 3 examples of them. Okay, war and nuclear weapons have not been used, but the threat has been made already. Now you have to put this in the context, a wider context, which is a context in which nuclear weapon states are modernizing their arsenals, developing new delivery vehicles, and this is all of that against the backdrop of deepening tensions between great powers, being in the Indo-Pacific region, being in Europe, or the part of the world. And therefore, the war in Ukraine has revealed something that, unfortunately, we may have forgotten, is that we still live under the threat of nuclear war. Now, let me just turn my page if I can. Now, this leads to a few key questions that I hope we will be able to discuss today. First, what roles does the Russian nuclear threat plays in the conflict in Ukraine? Also, is an escalation crossing the nuclear thresholds conceivable? More generally, are nuclear weapon states shifting from nuclear deterrence to nuclear coercion, blurring the line between conventional and nuclear wars? And what will be the impact of the Russo-Ukrainian war on the debate about nuclear vulnerabilities? Now, to talk about this crucial topic, I am very pleased to introduce our two panelists. First, Benoît Pelopidas. He is the founding director of the Nuclear Knowledges Program at Sciences Po Paris and an affiliate at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. Nuclear Knowledges offers conceptual innovation and unearth untapped primary sources worldwide to grasp nuclear vulnerabilities and rethink the scoping of possibilities in the realm of nuclear weapons policies. Benoît has been awarded 3 international prizes for his research and most recently the European Research Council starting grant on nuclear weapons choices. He just published Repenser les choix nucléaires. So this is a book in French that is about to be translated in English at Presse de Sciences Po. The other panelist on my left is Pavel Podvig. He is an independent analyst running his own research project called Russian Nuclear Forces. He is also a senior researcher at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, a researcher with the program on science and global security at Princeton University, and a member of the International Panel on Fissile Materials. His current research focuses on the Russian strategic forces and nuclear weapons complex, as well as technical and political aspects of nuclear non-proliferation, disarmament, missile defense, and US-Russia arms control processes. He graduated from both the Moscow Institute of Physics and Technology and the Moscow Institute of World Economy and International Relations. So I am honestly extremely honored to have these two persons in the room, because I think we cannot find a better panel to talk about this topic. Now, before closing my opening remarks and giving the floor to the panelists, just regarding the logistics. So Benoît and Pavel will talk for about 15 minutes each, and then we will open the floor for a Q&A session. For the people attending online, with regards to the Q&A session, please you raise your hand in the chat with the chat button, and I will give you the floor on a first come, first served basis. And also, please, of course, keep your microphone muted while the panelists are presenting and during the Q&A session if you have not been provided the floor. Many thanks. Now, without further ado, let me give the floor to Pavel Podvig for his presentation.
Oh, yeah, it's this one. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me. This is definitely a timely topic. And unfortunately, a timely topic. I think you contacted me about a couple of weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, and I was sort of hoping that by that time it will not be as acute as we felt it at that point. But unfortunately, no, it is not going away. And again, I think Russian foreign minister just the other day made this statement saying that yeah, the danger of use of nuclear weapons is should be taken seriously. And unfortunately, I think that it should be. We are at the point where it should be taken seriously, and we should think about the ways how to think about this threat, and what is more important, what kind of conclusions we can draw from the role that nuclear weapons play in this war. And I think if you go back into the history of the Cold War and post-Cold War, I think this may not be the very first time when nuclear weapons were kind of present in the conflict in that explicit way. But let me put it that way. No, this is not the first time nuclear weapons were present in a conflict, but this is probably the first time they were present in such an explicit and very deliberate way. We all remember that when Russian president announced the beginning of this quote-unquote special operation, he said that those of you who try to interfere would be met with a response that you've never seen in your history, which was a very direct reference to nuclear weapons. And then again, there was a couple of days later, there was a statement about Russian nuclear forces being placed on this special mode of combat duty, which also was supposed to signal that nuclear weapons are there. To some extent, that should not really come as a surprise, because all of you who looked into nuclear deterrence and the way nuclear deterrence works, that's actually how it works. This is you threaten a devastating response should you be attacked, and on certain level, the way that Russia introduced nuclear weapons here was not in itself aggressive or offensive. It was not a threat to attack anyone with nuclear weapons, but it was a very clear signal that if Russia will find itself under attack, that it will respond. So that's your deterrence kind of a distilled, if you will. At the same time, it is clear that nuclear weapons play somewhat, nuclear deterrence plays a very explicit role of enabling an aggression against Ukraine in this case, and that is also kind of this war exposed this role that nuclear weapons could play in various security disputes. In my view, what was interesting, in fact, to the extent these things are interesting, is that you could also see that nuclear deterrence doesn't work in the sense that while nuclear weapons to enable aggression, Russian aggression in this case, they don't seem to offer much protection to those who are supposedly find themselves under this nuclear umbrella of the United States. And that there are many signs of that. You would see, for example, that NATO is clearly discussing steps that would increase the conventional presence of NATO in on the NATO eastern flank. I've had quite a few conversations with mostly with journalists from the Baltic states, for example, and they don't feel particularly secure. They don't feel particularly protected. And in my view, it's just kind of dawned on people that if you are facing with a determined aggressor who actually for whom stakes in the conflict are high enough compared to your own, then actually you cannot really do much to deter that aggression with nuclear weapons, because that's the aggressor, Russia in this case, could always try to has an advantage in this kind of a game of chicken, if you will, but that's just the reality. So in a way, what in my view what we see is that we live in a kind of the worst of all worlds, which is that we see that nuclear weapons enable aggression. They don't offer much of a protection, and on top of that, there is a real danger of an escalation that could conceivably end up in a devastating and catastrophic nuclear exchange. So that's the reality we are confronted with these days. And to me, that's the kind of a signal for us all to kind of step back and reevaluate the role of nuclear weapons, the role that nuclear weapons play in the international security architecture and the national security architecture of those states that rely on them. So, what are how serious is the threat? What are those pathways to this catastrophic exchange? On the positive side is we can say that we are not there yet. As I mentioned, there is for all the kind of a posturing a nuclear saber rattling on the part of Russia, it's not yet the threat to use weapons kind of aggressively. In recent days, there are a lot of questions about what about Russia thinking about using nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons. And you may have seen that discussion here and there. And I think that we should be very clear here about the words and the terms and the potential effects. The term tactical nuclear weapons is quite a bit of a misnomer because if you think about it, any use of nuclear weapons in this conflict or other conflicts for that matter, most other conflicts would be strategic. That would be used, that would be designed to change the strategic outcome of the war. And from that perspective, again, if we look specifically at Ukraine, it is very clear that there are no plausible military missions for nuclear weapons. There are no ways nuclear weapons could help Russia achieve an advantage on the battlefield. There is no way nuclear weapons could help Russia compensate, quote unquote, for whatever failures of its conventional forces. It's just not that kind of a conflict. There are no tank columns driving across the plains of Ukraine toward the Kremlin. This is not how weapons could be used. The only possible use of nuclear weapons in this war would be not just strategic in terms of the goal, but it would be used as strategic as it was understood this strategic bombing during the World War II. So it would be a use against basically against civilian population with the not unlike the use of nuclear weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the World War II. Sort of you just aim to kill a lot of people to make sure that your opponent just gives up. Or again, I'm sure you've heard discussions about this kind of a demonstration strike. So Russia could potentially detonate a nuclear weapon in a way that would not necessarily harm anyone, but it would kind of demonstrate something. What would it demonstrate? And in my view, the only thing that this demonstration would show is the resolve to escalate and to end up killing a lot of people. So that's again, this is there are no military targets there. There are no military missions. So from that point of view, of course, this is how we should think about nuclear weapons in this context. Again, this is not about the support of conventional forces or some kind of a compensation. It would be a barbaric act of an attack against with a purpose of killing a lot of civilians. So in practical terms, that sort of macabre calculation, in a way, gives me at least a sort of hope that this threshold will not be crossed, because this is a very high threshold. So we're not talking about using weapons to stop advances of tanks. We are really the only context is this kind of a use against the civilian population. And this is a much higher threshold. This is what I hope will, in the end, deter the actual use. And in my view, the insurance, if you will, that we have is a very strong, consistent, and very clear signal to Russia in this case that even the thought about the use of nuclear weapons in this war should be condemned with utmost force, and even the thought should be condemned as criminal. In fact, so to what extent that would be, and that message should be kind of a consolidated message of, I don't know, the international community, as nebulous as this concept might be, but again, we've seen a bit of that. We've seen the General Assembly speaking against this. We've seen various world leaders speaking against the possibility of using weapons, and I think again the expert community should have its own strong voice here, and in my view, this is part of the reason why I'm normally cautious and try to avoid this whole discussion about the tactical versus strategic and all that, because again, we should be aware of the kind of a discussing this casually, because there is a real danger of kind of normalizing the use of weapons when we start discussing, oh, how many weapons would it take to take out Kyiv or to destroy Odessa, or so that's I think that's the wrong kind of the approach, because that way you kind of frame this issue as something conceivable, and it's just arguing whether it's proportionate or not, or justified. Again, in my view, the line should be drawn very clearly. No, any use should be considered criminal. So, do I have more time? Yeah. So, let me just finish on that note. That that in fact should be something we should think about building, the kind of the architecture of security. My ideal solution, if you will, in as far as Europe is concerned, is that we should try to build an arrangement that would in fact make it impossible to use or to involve nuclear weapons in any kind of conflict in Europe. I would much rather see this extended to everywhere, but at least the Europe should definitely be kind of off limits, and it should be inconceivable that anybody would even think about kind of involving nuclear weapons in a European conflict. How that arrangement may look like from a practical point of view, that's a different issue. There are ways of doing that. None of them are perfect, but again, in my view, it is about kind of drawing the line and holding that line in a way that really condemns nuclear weapons as just a barbaric instrument. So let me stop here, and I hope we'll have time for questions. Thank you.
So good evening, everyone. I want to start by thanking Lionel for the invitation and Webster University for having me tonight. I want to say that it's an honor to be sitting next to Pavel for this panel, because I've learned so much from him over the years. So what I will do in the next 10 or 15 minutes is essentially speak to, I think Lionel said at the very beginning about what the Ukraine war revealed. I'll also speak to what Pavel started with, which is it should be taken seriously that the use of nuclear weapons is possible. And mostly for you, dear students, I will speak to the topic of the event, which is the issue of, living under the nuclear threat. So I'll take a step back from the Ukraine situation, back to the notion of nuclear vulnerabilities, and I'll emphasize two dimensions of them: the material vulnerability and the epistemic dimension of our nuclear vulnerability. So very simply, and beyond the Ukraine crisis, what I want to lay out is the elements of evidence we have to show that the use of nuclear weapons, or in general, nuclear explosions, whether deliberate, inadvertent, or accidental, remain possible. This may seem basic, but it's important to just state that we know that this possibility remains. So simply, the pursuit of credibility in the practice of nuclear deterrence requires preparing for use of those weapons and communicating capability and willingness to use those weapons. It requires having a nuclear war planning community and essentially a bureaucracy that prepares for the use of those weapons. The doctrines are clear on that front. NATO, as well as most nuclear weapon states, we can talk about exceptions, doesn't have and has never had a no first use policy. So that's a window through which the possibility remains. Similarly, if we look at the nuclear weapon free zone treaties, not all nuclear weapon states have signed the additional protocols. All of those are simply spaces that make the nuclear explosions still conceivable, and that we know that they still are. And what we've learned about the force sizing of the US in Soviet and then Russian nuclear arsenal, including from Pavel's own work, is that the force sizing cannot be explained by the goal of nuclear deterrence alone. It also includes goals such as damage limitation should deterrence fail, which also opens avenues for nuclear weapons use. And that's my own work. In key instances, we've avoided unwanted nuclear explosions, not thanks to control practices, but thanks to luck. And I'm happy to develop on this if you're interested. Final kind of piece of evidence or type of evidence, if we look at crisis simulations or wargaming, including very recent one in the last year of the Obama administration, we have instances in which those games end with nuclear weapons use, including large-scale use of nuclear weapons, even when the people practicing the simulation are the people actually in the role of making those decisions. So for all of those reasons, it's simply inaccurate or wrong to say, okay, nuclear weapons use and nuclear explosions are impossible. At that point, you're like, Benoît is saying so many banalities. We knew that, and essentially the last 15 minutes just demonstrated that. Why am I stating what may seem obvious? It's precisely because that's inconvenient and uncomfortable knowledge. That's because we want to believe that this is not the case. So we often think and sometimes act as if the use of nuclear weapons or nuclear explosions, whether again deliberate, inadvertent, or accidental, was not possible. And so the gap between what we know that is what I've established about this material vulnerability. And what we want to believe is dangerous because it gives us an undue sense of security. And that speaks to one of the dangers that previous speakers have alluded to. And so here I'm just going to document 3 sources of our unwarranted disbelief in the possibility of nuclear weapons explosions. One source is simply exteriority. I mean, both of us think about nuclear weapons-related catastrophes when we wake up in the morning. We suspect that you don't, simply because our imaginations have boundaries. And since 1980, nuclear weapons tests no longer occur in the atmosphere. They are no longer visible, literally. A clicker problem, just a second. I have your arrow there. Okay, great. Then there is the issue of secrecy that essentially creates an obstacle to our knowledge about that. Here I'm just giving an example of a law that allows classification in perpetuity of pieces of evidence having to do with the nuclear past. And then we get what we have in a 2019 survey that we conducted of the European public, and in particular French respondents, many of whom simply say they've never really worried about the possibility of nuclear war. So that's exteriority. Here you see, that's just a graph that shows you, on the one hand, on the top curve, the number of articles in the main outlets of the French press about horizontal proliferation in Iran. So you see it's massively covered. In the bottom curve is articles covering all other possible sources of nuclear explosions or vertical proliferation. And you see all of those other elements which could possibly lead to the conceivability of nuclear explosions are massively under illustrated in the press. That contributes to this dimension of exteriority. The second source of our disbelief is simply that semi-official experts, by definition, are in a situation in which they cannot give us a complete picture of nuclear vulnerabilities, because their role is not simply to describe the world, but it's also to convince their audiences that deterrence actually works. And by definition, the official justification for deterrence practices is a definition and a justification in terms of protection, which overlooks the vulnerability. And so the expected performative effect of deterrence as a discourse essentially acts as something that prevents experts from articulating this possibility fully. A leading French strategist has articulated this clearly as an impossibility for him to simply say that deterrence could possibly fail and that explosions could possibly happen. So we're still under that limitation, and this is why independent scholarship is so important. A lot of scholarship before us has also documented how technicians of nuclear war and several people within the nuclear weapons establishment genuinely convince themselves that the weapons are perfectly controlled and that this cannot happen. So, if we ask them, then they will sincerely say, no, it's completely, under control, but they're in a position in which they couldn't possibly say otherwise. So that's a second source of unwarranted disbelief, the constraints under which official experts are. And I'm going to get to the third one here. Actually, we documented professional incentives to re-narrate cases of close calls as cases of control, provided that the explosion doesn't happen. So that's just, a famous case from a US nuclear history Robert Purifoy, a safety engineer at San Diego National Lab, who witnessed the 1961 Goldsboro accident and had to essentially fight a bureaucratic fight for 15 years for this accident to be recognized, whereas the upper management was simply saying, oh, no, don't talk about that, that's going to put us into trouble. So that's evidence that given the unique mandate of nuclear weapons related institutions, there are institutional and professional incentives to re-narrate failures that do not lead to nuclear explosions, to re-narrate them as cases of perfect control, even when they are not. That's simply a French example of the exact same dynamic. So I'll just skip it, and you can ask me a question if you want more about it. The third source of unwarranted disbelief is at the level of our imagination. German philosopher Gunther Anders calls us lazy people of the apocalypse because of the limitations of our imagination. He describes our situation as a situation of Promethean discrepancy, which articulates that we have a capability to destroy which far exceeds our ability to imagine what we can cause as harm. And so a campaign of interviews over 2 years shows that elites, military or political elites, do not escape that problem. It's also hard for them to believe in that possibility, whether they are on the pro-nuclear weapons front or on the anti-nuclear weapons front. I've conducted detailed interviews that document that. And what's striking and interesting is that from the 50s to the late 80s, early 90s, the team managed to document that fiction and visual popular culture was actually providing aesthetic gestures that helped us, viewers, position ourselves in a world in which those explosions and this material vulnerability was conceivable. From the 1990s onwards, nuclear weapons in popular culture has been depicted very differently, and the popular culture no longer helps us. Instead, it minimizes nuclear weapons-related harm. It pushes back the prospect of nuclear war into the past, and sometimes even elevates nuclear weapons as irreplaceable instruments of salvation. So we're no longer helped by popular culture to overcome our disbelief. And so there are, on top of that, additional psychological explanations that simply push also in the wrong direction. The famous retrospective illusion of control that I don't need to articulate further, our insensitivity to very large numbers. And finally, the effective authority of reassuring experts, because we want to believe them when they say, don't worry. So I'll conclude by saying simply that, as Lionel kicked us off with, the situation today is that material nuclear vulnerabilities have become palatable again. But the camp of reassurance and disbelief is at work. There's a lot of discussion about, don't worry, it's going to be controlled. There's a discussion about escalation control even. And so here I'm going to propose a leap that I hope you'll authorize me, which is, if this war ends without a nuclear weapons use, which is what we all hope, the question will be what is learned from it. And just to echo what Pavel said at the end, the key will be that we stop equating absence of nuclear weapons use with success of nuclear deterrence. And we actually remember the enabling role that practices of nuclear deterrence played in that war, and also the fact that we may get to a point of no nuclear weapons use, not necessarily thanks to nuclear deterrence, but possibly in spite of or independently from nuclear deterrence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, to both of you. It was enlightening and frightening, I would say. Yes, I know, Jobin, you have a question. But just to launch the Q&A session, allow me to actually use my prerogatives as the moderator to ask myself two questions that I'm very curious about. The first one, to follow up on what you said, Benoît, about the Promethean discrepancy. Well, not only it's scary, but I mean, you mentioned in the fact that certain high-profile people are affected by that. You mentioned Reagan. I mean, he had the nuclear fire into his hand, right, during the 1980s. And I mean, the question is, if our Cold War era nuclear deterrence theories, Thomas Schelling and all the other people, are based on the rationality assumption, and now you told us about the Promethean discrepancy. I mean, it means that the theory do not have solid foundations, because if I understood well, the Promethean discrepancy goes against rationality. Or not?
Okay, so the challenge here is that I need to talk about nuclear deterrence, rationality, and the Promethean discrepancy in less than a minute.
Sorry.
So let's see how I can do that. If it's miserable, you know, don't be angry at me, please. So I guess what I would say on rationality is, yeah, I think two things. One is the so-called third wave of deterrence research. In the most recent literature in cognitive psychology, I'm thinking mostly about the work by Rose McDermott and her colleagues, has shown that if we want to keep the edifice of rational deterrence theory consistent, we need at the heart of it an element of anger and revenge, because otherwise retaliation, which needs to be credible, simply isn't rational. So the critique of rationality has been done, well done. I'm here really echoing other scholars. The Promethean discrepancy is at the imaginal level. I think the extra critique of rationality that I would be bringing is really the argument about luck. The fact that there are cases that we can demonstrate with archive in interviews in which we've avoided unwanted nuclear weapons use, not thanks to success of practices of control, but either in spite of those practices, thanks to failures or disobedience, or independently from those control practices. And the last thing I'll say is my kind of overview of cases of luck, which you can find in the book and in other pieces of work, is most likely an underestimation, because it depends on available archives and available sources, meaning it's mostly about the US and the UK and a little bit about France. So in order to believe that my estimation of the role of luck is complete, you need to believe that while we've had tens of cases of that kind in 2 or 3 nuclear weapon states, you would have to assume that there's no such case in all the other nuclear weapon states, which would be probably the most optimistic assumption of that evening.
May just add to on that rationality point and deterrence. I think again, back to this war in Ukraine, it is an interesting example, in my view, of a failure of deterrence, because again, the act of starting that war, if you think about it, it was deeply irrational, and it was made in the face of clear threats of economic sanctions and all that. So you could, I guess you could interpret it in many ways and say, oh, it wasn't really a nuclear deterrence, it was, and maybe it wasn't credible and all that, but that's, I mean, the fundamentals are there. So there was an attempt to deter this aggression, and it didn't work. And from any kind of rational point of view, this war, and it was clear that the consequences would be pretty serious for Russia, the Russian society, the Russian economy, and all that. And that didn't deter. So because, again, this is back to my point about this kind of a asymmetry of stake and a determined aggressor, that shows you that, well, you cannot, in some cases, you cannot really rely on the assumption of rationality. And it just, the fact that it wasn't the nuclear war, that, well, I mean, to me, that doesn't give me much comfort, because I mean, when I'm projecting this irrational act onto the possibility of nuclear use, I mean, it tells me that, well, you cannot really assume that decisions will be made rationally and with some access to information and analysis and all that.
Thank you. So we go to the Q&A. For those online, already raise your hand in the chat as soon as possible, because I guess we will have a lot of questions in the room. So who will go first? Sir, if you can just bring the microphone.
Good evening, everyone. I would like to introduce myself. I'm from Russian mission. And I really thank you, Miriam University, for organizing such an important event. And I think that everyone needs to listen to other side as well. Of course, unfortunately, one side every time introduced in Western society, Western mass media, and of course. Let's back to our issue, nuclear deterrence and possibility of use of nuclear weapons in this conflict. And I have to tell that we have to consider such kind of possibility very seriously. First of all, because I can agree with Pavel Podvig that the use of nuclear weapons in this conflict should not be deemed as in the context of relationship between Russia and Ukraine, because it is quite obvious that nuclear weapons cannot be used and cannot provide any party in the conflict any advantages in the battlefield. It goes without saying. That's why we have to look at the reasons why our government decided to raise the level of the readiness of our nuclear weapons. First of all, it was made in the response of some officials from United Kingdom that they would like to interfere in this conflict. And we deemed Ukraine as an ally of NATO, nuclear NATO, first of all. That's why it was a reason for us to launch this military operation. And the second, the use of nuclear weapons in the conflict as a battlefield, purposes is impossible, because right now we are protecting our people in Ukraine. It is very important because our goal is to destroy military infrastructure. And also, I would like to mention that it is necessary to consider our nuclear policy and to read our nuclear policy. And it's a well-known fact that back in 2012.
Sorry, do you have a question for the panel?
Yes. My question will be.
Okay, thanks.
Next.
Thank you.
I would like just to recall to everyone that back in 2012 to 20, our government adopted, our president signed a decree that stipulates some conditions that regarding the use of nuclear weapons. 4 conditions actually, and that's why 2 of them was mentioned, that in case of conventional war, the second one in retaliation of nuclear weapon use, and there were 2 other conditions That's why my question. Probably when we heard the statements of our president, our Minister of Foreign Affairs, maybe he was referred to these two unknown conditions that could lead to nuclear weapons, nuclear war in this conflict. Please, could someone answer?
Yeah, I think, well, let's set aside the part about why Russia started this war. So I guess we would not agree here, but that's a different issue. On the conditions, and I think you made an important point, which is that there is a certain declaratory policy that Russia officially announced, and it is, in my view, it is in fact very important to remind everyone, including Russian government, that this is the policy and that policy should be adhered to. The conditions are that, as you mentioned, if Russia finds itself under an attack by nuclear weapons, so Russia reserves the right to use nuclear weapons if it is attacked by nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction, and if it is under attack, under conventional attack, that threatens the very existence of the state. That was very clear. But that was, in fact, in a military doctrine from 2014. The 2020 document added specific things, as you correctly noted, that it was if Russia will detect missiles coming to its territory, or if Russia is under, I don't remember the exact phrase, but basically if there is interference with its strategic forces that threaten the ability of strategic forces to deliver retaliatory strikes. So, and that could be broadly understood, and if you want to, you could interpret it as for example, a cyber attack against the command and control system that could potentially be interpreted like that. This is also important to keep that in mind. However, we have seen that, in fact, there was a bit of restraint on the part of the United States and NATO in general. They were very cautious about not being certain that there was no direct military contact between any NATO forces and Russian forces. I am certain that people in the United States and specifically and in other in NATO states as well, they are aware of those conditions, and I'm sure that they are conscious about those conditions, and they do what they can not to make steps that are that would cross those lines. The problem, of course, is that the interpretation of these of any actions in this conflict is would not be made by you or me or someone in Washington, D.C. or in London. The interpretation would be made by the Russian Russian leadership. And they may have different ideas of what the threat to the survival of the state is, and to what extent certain actions could be considered a conventional attack that threatens the survival of the state. I don't want to go into kind of a specific detailed scenarios, but I would just say that there are pathways to places where that interpretation could lead the leadership in Moscow to conclude that Russia is indeed under the threat, and there with all the consequences. Because even if you look at the current war, the official justification was that the demilitarization of Ukraine is necessary because at some point down the line, maybe 10, maybe more years down the road, Ukraine may present a threat to security of the Russian Federation. That was officially said that was the reason that Russia started that operation. But this is a highly contested statement. And but then again, it wasn't up to you or me or the government in Kyiv to make that determination. That was the determination that was made in Moscow, and that basically makes me worry that other determinations could be made in a similar way. Thanks.
No.
Okay. Another question. So I saw Abdulaziz first, so I'm trying to be fair. Abdulaziz, try to be concise.
That's not fair. So my name is Abdulaziz Khan, and I am a student of international relations in Webster University. First of all, I would like to thank both the panelists and the university for arranging such a conference that is providing us education and letting us know of how the world is operating on a big scale and what are the evils and the hopes that we should be known about, the optimism and the, let's say, rather pessimistic side of world. Well, I have a lot of questions, but as the professor asked me to be concise, I would ask one question. It's a very simple question with two parts. So Mr. Pavel Podvig said that nuclear deterrence is basically threatening that should you be attacked, you will respond in kind. I added the kind. Then leading on further illustrating that the threshold for that is certainly not achieved, and we're not at that stage, irrespective of what we are being told by the media, that, oh God, the tensions are high and this and that, and we are on the verge of a nuclear war. As you further elaborated, that certainly is not the case. We're definitely not there because the threshold is very, very high. I would like to ask, the first part of the question is, the first question that was mentioned by Mr. Leon Faton of the transition of nuclear deterrence to nuclear coercion, how would you link that with this, with what basically you said, that we are not at that level making threats or saying that we could potentially use nuclear forces or that the use of nuclear force should not be understated? Is that a way or a door to nuclear coercion? So that's the first part. The second part is Mr. Pelopidas said that avoiding nuclear explosions till date, what you consider is through sheer luck. So should an unintentional nuclear explosion in a hypothetical case occur, and I'm referring to the United Nations here, who would be held accountable? Because certainly the relevant parties would argue that it was not intentional and it was, let's say, human error or whatnot, then that's one part who would get held accountable and who will hold the accountability, basically, considering that the United Nations has been chronically unable to mediate the situation that is at hand. Thank you very much.
Okay, since the first question was to me, the nuclear coercion, I think it's I think it's an oversold concept in a way, because I don't think that, well, I mean, we could probably think of other examples, but you take Russian invasion in Ukraine. I mean, theoretically, you could imagine that Russia is a nuclear power. Why wouldn't Russia coerce Ukraine into doing whatever Russia wanted to do by, I don't know what, threatening use of nuclear weapons? I mean, that didn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. It's not, it wasn't even considered in many ways. It did take, the attempt did take the shape of a conventional invasion. There are other examples. If you look at North Korea, for example, pretty much all nuclear weapon states were adamant against North Korea's getting nuclear weapons. And were they successful? Not really. So, and you would think that their nuclear weapons would give them some kind of a power to coerce North Korea into doing this or that. No, that didn't happen. Or you take Iran and Iranian program, and again, you would think that sort of, again, nuclear weapons would coerce Iran into abandoning its efforts or limiting its program in some way. No, it didn't work like that. So I think that that's the, again, to me, I may be in minority here, but to me, I think that the power of nuclear weapons is overrated. They are not really that powerful in terms of what they give you. But they do work in certain circumstances, again, as we see in the case of the current war. And to me, that's just the evidence that suggests that we should really think about how to take that role out of them as well.
Thank you. So I would have wanted to engage in that, but I'll take the question that was directed to me about accountability. And I guess I'll answer in 3 steps. Step 1 would be, there is no institutional design ready today for accountability for large-scale nuclear harm, other than, harm caused by nuclear testing in specific nations. So, for example, in France, there is a law called La Loi Morin in 2010, which creates a compensation mechanism for victims of nuclear harm. And so we could have a conversation about, how that's created, how that's measured, and so on and so forth. But so overall, what you had on mind was like large-scale nuclear explosions, no accountability mechanisms available today. So second step is simply that in scholarship, sorry, I'm really treating you as a student, there is a pretty interesting article by George Perkovich on how to design such an institution. It's in the Journal for Peace and Nuclear Disarmament. I would encourage you to look at it. And the third step is simply that if we're talking about large-scale use, it's very clear that there's not going to be any accountability, because either most participants will be dead or they will benefit from a rally around the flag effect. And here, to fall back on my point on popular culture, there is a fabulous short story made into a movie called A Clean Escape about exactly that. How the person who started nuclear war survives, but genuinely forgets that he started nuclear war. So in order to prosecute him, in that case, that's a he, you would need to get him to confess, but he sincerely cannot confess because he has forgotten that he did it. So the accountability problem, or lack thereof, is a crucial element that needs to be factored in the discussion about the future of nuclear weapons.
Thank you. Angelina.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Angelina. I'm a freshman in Webster University Geneva. And thank you for organizing this conference and shedding light on the current use and power of nuclear weapons. I have two questions. First is, so the experience and practice is the key for estimating how effective a nuclear weapon will be in war. And do you think that it is easier for Russia to estimate the efficiency of their nuclear weapons because of its history connected with these nuclear weapons? And the second is, Russia is against, as far as I'm concerned, Russia is against the no first use policy. So do you think that it is possible, realistically speaking, to convince Russia to pledge the no first use policy?
Thank you. I guess I'll take that. Well, about the effectiveness, yes, there are. I mean, I guess Russia, as any other state, has a way of judging the performance of its nuclear weapons. Or these are engineering systems, after all, and there is a certain methodology. You know that this will work and achieve a certain yield with certain probabilities. So that these are all known. And in a way, everybody else just kind of relies on the fact that Russian engineers, Russian scientists sort of know what they do. On the other hand, if on the extreme, if you accept this notion that nuclear weapons are there only to deter and they are never supposed to be used, then you may not care about efficiency at all. For all you care, these could be just concrete dummies. And if nobody knows that they are concrete dummies, then why would anybody? So it is there is a bit of a theater here. So you sort of we rely on the weapons designers to know what they're doing. Sort of we trust them, and to some extent it's a rational point on our part, because we have to assume that those things will work if they're used, and we need to build our policies based on that assumption. It would be different. Regarding the no first use, it's I guess there is a good argument that basically everybody should accept no first use policies. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, as I said, we really should kind of rethink our the place of nuclear weapons overall. And in my view, we all will be better off if those weapons are eliminated, and there are practical ways of doing so. In fact, if you sort of speaking specifically about Russia, my strong conviction, and I'm on record with that Russia would be much better off without nuclear weapons, actually. It would be a more secure, more prosperous, more happy country in many ways. So, but it is difficult to kind of construct this reality, as I'm sure that our participants from the Russian missions would be very much against this kind of notion. But you don't really need nuclear weapons for your security. I mean, there are other ways of building your security, and the world without nuclear weapons is perfectly possible. It's difficult, but it is possible.
Kamakshi and then Sir. Just Kamakshi was first, and then Sir, I can give the floor.
Hi, my name is Kamakshi. I'm also a freshman. I'm a student here. I'm studying international relations and psychology. Thank you for this talk about the potential nuclear war that might happen and cause global disruptions. I think it's interesting that we're questioning the use of nuclear weapons when Russia is using it. But what about the time when the US was invading Iraq and they used similar ways? To what extent do you think was that justified? Was that also like Russian, or was it strategy, or was it needed? What's your...
Let me start. No, I think this is a very good question, and this is it is a very good point about the power of norms that were violated in Iraq. I mean, it is very important to keep in mind that when we are talking about that, oh, the Russian invasion in Ukraine was unlawful, unprovoked, and all that, so was the US invasion in Iraq. So was, well, there are other cases are maybe more complicated, but that was the case. And this is when I back to kind of my point about the kind of criminality of thinking about nuclear weapons. That should apply to everyone, not just to Russia. It should apply equally to NATO, to the United States, and others. I think that there was an episode early in the war, or I think even before, that I think it was the French foreign minister who basically, in response to this Russian mention of nuclear weapons, he said, "Oh, we also have nuclear weapons," and there someone kind of commented on that, sort of that this is kind of a nuclear weapon waving. That's very unhelpful, and that is unhelpful. So the message here should be not that these things are Russia is prohibited from doing that, but others or the United States is okay. No, nobody should be okay with that. Nobody should get away with that. And that's again, that's the message about the criminality of barbaric nature of nuclear weapons, if you will.
So I'll second every single thing that Pavel has said, and simply add maybe one more example to remind you that nuclear weapon states sometimes feel emboldened by the possession of nuclear weapons and feel emboldened to, including do land grabs. And I just wanted to bring up the Cargill case in 1999, where that was really the same sense that we can do that under the nuclear shadow. And even when particular leaders make decisions like that, they don't necessarily shift because we theorists would want them to coercion speak, but they still say it's about deterrence. You can still talk about deterrence and feel that you're kind of enabled to do land grabs because of your nuclear weapons possession. So we're just listing a series of examples which kind of forces us to think beyond the idea that nuclear deterrence, because of the name, is strictly defensive.
No, I would just add that in case of Iraq, of course, there was no nobody threatened, sort of, the United States didn't have to threaten anyone with nuclear response because nobody was coming to support Iraq. So that was kind of a different, but fundamentally, so I wouldn't say that nuclear weapons enabled US invasion in Iraq in 2003. No, that was not the case. But on fundamental level, that was also an act of aggression. That's very clear.
So the question that I have is the expansion of NATO along the borders of Russia is the threat perception to Russia is real. It's not something that is imagined. And I think Vladimir Putin has been extremely patient to say stop. But I think the West has continued. Now we are where we are. How do we save face in a situation like this? How do we save face? How do we say, Mr. Putin, you go that way? How do we save face given the situation?
This is a long story, and I would recommend you to read this book. There's a fairly recent book by Mary Sorote called Not One Inch. Yeah, it's a very good account with it. It's a controversial story. And I don't want to go into this kind of who is guilty of what. I think neither side managed it well. In my view, speaking of how do you solve that? So in my view, ideally, what we would need, sort of the way to solve this kind of a security equation, if you will, in Europe, is to reach a state in which nobody would care if a state is in NATO or not. So that's, and it would be, and in fact, at some point we were sort of on the trajectory that would take us there, but it didn't work for a variety of reasons. But that's, I do believe that kind of going to kind of the world, the Cold War 2.0 with the confrontation of the kind, that is, I mean, again, many of my kind of colleagues in NATO, they say, oh, but NATO is kind of a foundation of European security and all that. And I say, well, do Europeans feel particularly secure these days? No, that's not sort of that's not. And again, we can talk about sort of discuss who is to blame or not, and what can or cannot be done. But in the end, I think we should understand that the only way of doing that is to making sure that nobody cares. And if we get there, that may require a different. It will definitely require a different Russia, as they say, the beautiful Russia of the future. But that's otherwise it just will not work. I mean, just cordoning off Russia. Russia is there geographically. It's not going to disappear.
We will have a last question, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan. My name is it on?
It's on, yes.
My name is Abraham, ex-Webster. I think this whole concept of threat is at its very embryonic stage. We are talking about, I remember after 1945, the world was reconstituted and we had the big five, making sure that everything is working well. But today, that's not the case, because it's gone far beyond the big five, almost like no one cares for the big five. Because many other states, including North Korea, that you mentioned, have already started a nuclear program. So the time may come, I'm not a prophet of doom, but to say that this will come. we only have a handful of maybe a dozen countries that have nuclear capability, and yet we have over 193 states in the world. So the day will come. So for us, we might be protected and be saved at this point in time. I'm not so sure that the future generation will be. Thank you.
Take two.
Jovin, you had a question?
Yeah, I want to say something. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Jubin Godarzi, the acting head of the International Relations Program here. So thank you for coming and enjoyed your presentations. I just wanted to make one or two quick observations in terms of when the largest country in the world with the largest nuclear arsenal attacks a neighboring country, of course, that's cause for concern and consternation. But going back to also what was said earlier, there is, of course, a broader context to what happened, whether you want to go back to 1991 regarding unification of Germany, NATO expansion, or back to 2007 when Vladimir Putin made his famous speech at Munich. So I think there is a context in terms of what has happened. Of course, invading another country is by no stretch of the imagination justifiable. I would take issue, though, that from perhaps the Russian perspective or the Kremlin, Putin's perspective, this is an irrational act. We actually had an event here 2 days before the invasion with 4 panelists. And I and many of the others did not think that there would be a war, that there would be an invasion. But I think it would be too reductionist to call what happened an irrational act from the Russian perspective. And in terms of my colleague Lionel Faton, what he said about the initial statements which have been emanating from Moscow, including the first when Putin said when Russia put its nuclear forces on alert. I actually was not aware what the gentleman from the Russian mission said about the British statement. But I vividly recall the statement made in the German Bundestag by the newly appointed German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, that Germany publicly saying was going to supply arms to Ukraine. And as soon as I heard that, and in view of what I know, my limited knowledge of Russian and Soviet history, I said to myself, there is going to be some sort of Russian response, in the sense that if we look at the history of World War I, the Second World War, that Russia will respond in somehow, at least in terms of threatening rhetoric, because from the Russian perspective, any moves or any statement by Germany in view of its history, with its troubled history with Germany, is going to provoke something. And let us not forget, of course, there's no Soviet Union anymore. But let's remember that NATO was created in 1949, and the Soviet Union did not react until the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, was made a member of NATO in 1955, and the Soviet Union responded by creating the Warsaw Pact. So, but anyway, I've enjoyed your presentations, and if you have any comments, I'd be glad to hear them. Thank you.
Yeah, let me try it. I think I would agree with you that there are various steps here that states make, and we don't know what the reaction would be, what the effect would be, and I think nobody knows, and nobody in Moscow knows, nobody in Berlin or Washington DC, and this is where I see these are pathways to escalation. And it would take, in my view, it would take courage and wisdom and caution to actually navigate through all that without consequences. I hope that we will have that, but it is a very dangerous path. I agree, and but I would say that. This is why it is important to create this kind of pressure and create this clear understanding that whatever happens, nuclear weapons should be off the table. It just should be inconceivable in no circumstances. And again, for all parties involved.
So since this is the last question, and since you mostly spoke to this question, I'll answer the gentleman's comments. And if Lionel allows me, I'd like to finish with just two suggestions for the students, very briefly. So to your point, sir, on no one, so I'm going to connect the point you made about the 5 permanent members and your sense that they're kind of fading away and that future generations will be different. I want to essentially argue against that in connection with future generations, precisely simply because the P5 possess over 96% of nuclear arsenals on the planet. And if you look, thinking about future generations, if you look at CO2 emissions, the P5 are responsible for 50% of CO2 emissions in 2019 and roughly 50% of historic emissions since 1750. So I don't see any way that one can get to the point that they fade away into oblivion. The good piece of news, though, is that the first part of the book, I hope, would convince you that horizontal proliferation is not inevitable, and that precisely no nuclear weapon state today has achieved nuclear weapons status without the help of at least one of those P5 members. So that's an important element to connect everything to the P5 questions. So very briefly to the students here. So 2 things for you. One is find a way to overcome the idea that nuclear weapons can stay there forever and never be used. Can find a way to overcome this disbelief. As Pavel said, if we want to kind of advocate for abolition, think about it and move forward. If you don't want to advocate for abolition, think beyond the binary where it's either abolition or status quo. You can think about plenty possible worlds which are not the one we are in with 13,000 nuclear weapons, because 13,000 nuclear weapons is in excess even for believers in nuclear deterrence.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Benoît. Thank you so much, Pavel, for this discussion. It was really enlightening for us. Thank you for coming here on campus. And thank you, of course, the audience for the good questions you had, and hopefully see you soon. Thank you. Thank you.